Okay, everybody, we're talking today the general conversation about how we're supposed to respond to this moment. And according to nonviolent philosophy, nonviolent political philosophy, as articulated by Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King, educating ourselves is a large part of the process. Knowledge is power. So one of the things that I think it's so important for all of us to educate ourselves about right now is fascism. I love history. I've read a lot of books about World War II, read a lot about FDR. So I have pretty rudimentary knowledge of we were fighting the fascists and Mussolini and Hitler and what they did. But it never occurred to me in a million years, I don't think it would have occurred to any of us, that this would become a critically relevant subject to our own place in time. I saw a lot of name calling on social media. I think it was Newsom, I'm not sure, called Miller a fascist. No, you can't call somebody a fascist. It was like children on a playground. Fascism is not name calling. It's not an accusation alone. It's a description of specific behavior. And sometimes when we know it in our gut, ooh, that's fascist. Yeah, you can know it in your gut, but that's not going to be enough to handle this thing, to stand up to what's happening. So I have a very special guest here today. John Lestrange, who you might have seen online. I've seen them as the history wizard, historian and author specializing in genocide studies. They graduated with a master's degree in Holocaust and Genocide Studies from Kean University in 2017. Since then has been using their degree to provide free and accessible education, free of jargon as possible, to people through social media sites such as TikTok and Instagram. John, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
You know, I think your bio says it all. You make it very accessible. It's not some high and mighty academic topic. It's like, what is it and what does it look like? You know, I've talked to people, John, about a book I read several months ago, Madeleine Albright's book, Fascism, A Warning. And I appreciated that book because it was simple. It laid out what it is. This is what authoritarianism is. This is what totalitarianism is. This is what fascism is. She talked about Mussolini. She talked about the fact that Hitler sort of idolized Mussolini. Mussolini did begin, really, would you consider him the first political fascist in terms of beginning a political movement?
So Mussolini was the politician who more or less coined the term fascism. The things that we look at when we consider fascism certainly existed within various regimes prior to Mussolini, but he was the one he was the first to write about fascism as a distinct ideology. He was the first person to do something that, and then just flat out call it fascism. So yeah, more or less, Mussolini, is the progenitor of this particular modern movement.
First of all, I have two questions. First of all, to lay it out for people, what is it? And second, you just referred to something that I've always found so curious. He bragged about being a fascist. Hitler bragged about being a fascist. I mean, when Hitler said they call us barbarians, we're honored by the title. So would you talk to us about exactly what it is? And number two, what is the psychology of people who brag about it like it's an okay thing?
Yeah, so Mussolini had originally actually been a socialist,
Yeah.
and then decided that it wasn't good enough. It didn't do enough of the things that he wanted it to do. So he sort of developed this. So fascism, right, as we can define fascism generally, and then we can define fascism very specifically. Generally speaking, fascism is just it's a far right authoritarian political ideology that revolves around extreme nationalism and generally near the end of its run puts corporations in charge of your political organizations, right? It marries very heavily your economy and your politics in a way that doesn't put, right, your government in charge of your industry, but it puts your industry in charge of your politics. And everything sort of revolves around this extreme nationalism, and this extreme sort of corporatism is the easiest way to define that.
Okay, so I want to ask you a couple questions.
Yeah.
First of all, you talked about how you'd been a socialist first. Usually we associate socialism with the left. So
Yes.
wouldn't it be correct to say that there's left-wing fascism and right-wing fascism?
So it's this is an area where a lot of people tend to get confused on, because you do, right, when you talk about socialism as it's developing, especially in like places like South America, where we've seen it a lot, especially with things like Operation Condor from the United States and our attempts to, stop that during the Cold War and overthrow those regimes, right? The talk of nationalizing industries. The best way that I found to sort of sum up the difference between fascism and socialism to make it understandable to the average person is that in socialism, the government is in control of your industry, and in fascism, your industry is in control of your government.
Well, that's what the whole corporatism issue is, that the
Yes.
corporatism is the step towards fascism in that it is a step towards the marriage of, the political system and the
Right. So you
government.
have to look at whether your political systems are using industry to create infrastructure that will benefit people, or whether your industry is creating infrastructure that will benefit them through government assistance. I think that once you get to the point where you are putting the interests of industry above the interests of the people, you've moved away from being left wing and you've moved into
Yeah,
being right wing.
that's interesting. So, and that's exactly right. And that's why some of the most famous fascists started out as left and sort of flipped to far right. And I think that Mussolini would be an example of that.
Yeah.
Now, the second thing you brought up there was nationalism. Nationalism as well as corporatism. We talked about corporatism a little bit, which has been an issue in the United States, even within neoliberalism. I mean, anytime you start saying that corporate profit should be the guiding principle of your economy and thus your society, you're basically in corporatist territory, moving towards the potential for fascism, which is what has been happening in the last 20 years in the United States. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. No, the United States has been just really since Reagan, the United States has
Yeah.
been like that's probably the clearest defining moment of the US's slow descent into what we would consider pure fascism.
Yeah, well, and we hung around fascism adjacent for far too long,
Yeah.
and did not heed the warnings. This word nationalism is a big one because I was always brought up to believe that nationalism is not a good thing. It's patriotism is a good thing. It's love of your country, but not at the expense of other countries.
Hmm.
Nationalism is where you're sort of, it's like America's supremacy. That's what I see the America First movement about. It's not great among great nations. It's first and above all and at the expense of. Is that is that how you would see nationalism?
So nationalism is one of those terms that has more nuance to it than we generally expect it to. Because when you see nationalism in, right, your dominant cultures, your dominant economies, then it tends to be a bad thing. It tends to be that supremacist ideology that you mentioned previously. But then when we talk about, nationalism, we also see that just in the context of like Irish nationalism and Irish republicanism, right? Which is generally seen as
Liberating?
yeah, yeah. So,
Yeah.
Irish nationalism and Irish
Yeah, or
republicanism is generally
Scottish.
seen as, pushing back against British, imperialism and colonialism against, the areas nearest to them. So amongst those, there's a term in genocide studies called subaltern, right, which generally refers to when we're looking at like the Haitian Revolution and then the massacre that occurred against the French after it, right, where we're looking at you know, the lower end of the socioeconomic groups, right? So like the Hutu versus the Tutsi, the Tutsi were the dominant economic group in Rwanda at the
Rwanda.
time, right? And then the Hutu, committed the genocide against them. So that kind of, from beneath coming up, that kind of, revolution, revolt, genocide that can occur sometimes, right? It can, right, veer into a bad area when we see it as, you know, only us and no
Yeah.
one else. But,
Yeah.
right, there are a lot of nationalist movements that exist in areas amongst marginalized communities that are generally considered to be good things, except amongst the,
Yeah.
you know,
Well, I
the people
think,
who benefit from that unequal power
yeah.
structure.
So what you're saying is there's a spectrum, but I would suggest
Yes.
it would be good if we just had another word. For instance, Christian nationalism, the
Yes.
idea that one religion should be lifted and exalted above all others is, in my mind, or one people exalted above all others is never a good thing. You did mention the word genocide,
Yep.
and I think we should move on now to the topic of Hitler.
Sure.
Many people now bring up the topic of Hitler. You know, I would love it. I tell you something, I would love it. So the black cat, it's a fully black cat, right?
That's Hera in the background. She is a tortoise. She's a tortoiseshell cat. She is very needy, and she will be in the background for a bit. She doesn't want to cooperate right now. We're just
Okay,
gonna.
maybe she will before our interview is over. A lot of times people talk about, well, don't use the Hitler analogy, but sometimes I feel that people who say don't use the Hitler analogy don't know enough about Hitler. So if you could take us through some basic steps. First attempt at the coup in 23, Night of the Long Knives, the Reichstag fire. These are all terms we throw around, but I think a lot of people could really use some basic education.
Yeah, so just to start off, the reason why we use the, Hitler as an analogy, right, for, fascism and ultranationalism and all of these things is because he's probably the most relevant cultural touchstone that we have. The Holocaust and, the Third Reich are one of the most studied things in, at least in US, history curriculums. But yeah, I mean, Hitler sort of followed, what we would consider the classic formula of a fascist overthrow of power. Generally speaking, fascism is a science to a certain degree in that it does test things, right? Because Hitler tried, there was the beer hall push in 1923, and that failed, right? There was an
And then he
attempted
went to
over.
prison. He
Yeah,
was thrown in prison for that, wasn't he?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he went in prison. That's where he wrote Mein Kampf. But there was an attempt to overthrow the Weimar government because they thought, like, oh, maybe the people are ready. Maybe they are upset enough. Maybe they're angry enough about how they're being undermined by the Treaty of Versailles and all of their neighbors, and maybe we can get away with this now. And they found out, no, that's not the case. And
I'd like
then,
to, if I may, I want to interrupt you for just a moment because you mentioned something that I think is very important. You talked about the Treaty of Versailles. And I think it's generally acknowledged that the Treaty of Versailles, which was the official ending of World War I, basically, was unfair to the German people, correct?
yeah, yeah,
And it was
absolutely.
because it was basically Deutschmark till we tell you to stop. And it's interesting because Woodrow Wilson, who I have a lot of criticism of Woodrow Wilson on other things, but on this issue, he said that that was a mistake. Now, the crushed people, and this seems so important to me, John, and this is what I've been talking about in this country for years now. Anytime you have large groups of desperate people, this becomes like a petri dish out of which all manner of societal dysfunction is almost inevitable, whether it has to do with personal dysfunctional behavior or even to ideological capture by genuinely psychotic forces such as fascism, attraction to strong men, etc. So I think that that's so important. Would you say that Hitler could not have found the listening that he found had the German people not been so crushed and humiliated after World War I?
No, absolutely. So Hitler, he served in World War One. He was a soldier in there, and afterwards he served. He worked for the German government as basically an educator, right? He went around and he gave lectures, in various towns and in front of schools, and just basically, to a certain extent, doing what I'm doing now, although with far more nefarious purposes. He went in front of people and he preached his political ideology, in an effort to educate them about it. But that sort of appeal to, the frustrations and the anxieties and the fears of your fellow country folk, it doesn't really work if there aren't already fears and anxieties. And the
Right,
Treaty of
right, right,
Versailles
right.
made a lot
Like
of
someone else we
those.
know.
Yeah. No, absolutely. It's how fascism and genocide and authoritarian takeovers work every single time throughout history. You have a time where there are concerns amongst the people, right? There are issues. There's economic turmoil. There's national shame. There's whatever kind of thing that just makes people feel bad about the fact that they exist in a given society. And then some guy comes in and he says, "Hey, it's not your fault. It's this group's fault. And
That's
we can
right.
solve all of our problems if we just get rid
Get
of them."
rid of them.
Exactly.
And one of the things that I think the first time I saw you and started watching you, showed up on my feed. You talked about how authoritarianism to fascism, it doesn't happen in one fell swoop. These things are gradual. That's why I think it's helpful to know about even what you just said about Hitler. He started in 1923. I mean, this stuff doesn't happen overnight. So please continue. And then, so he gets out of prison. He
Yeah.
wrote Mein Kampf in prison.
Yeah, he
And
wrote
give a
Mein Kampf in
little,
prison.
and hold on, if I may, tell people, what was Mein Kampf?
So Mein Kampf was more or less Hitler's manifesto. The interesting thing is that it didn't do very well when it first came out. It was published in 2 volumes, and it was it was a commercial flop when it first came out, and then it became sort of required reading post 1933 when Hitler was appointed the Chancellor of Germany, when the Nazis had the majority in the Reichstag. But it was just sort of the easiest way to describe Mein Kampf is it was Hitler's diary in which he complained about all of the people that had wronged him and all of the things. It was a teenager's diary, is what Mein Kampf is,
It
right?
was a
Where
what diary?
it was a teenager's diary. We just complained about all of the people and the things that had wronged him and the society and all of the things that he felt that he should have had but didn't for X, Y, and Z reasons. It was a childish rant is really ultimately what Mein Kampf was. But it also was just, it spelled out fully what the plan was, right? Long before Hitler did the things that he did, he told people pretty much exactly what he was going to do in a book that he wrote. And the people that read it either were forced to because it was required reading by the Nazi government, or they read it and thought, ah ha ha, good joke. This is ridiculous. No one would ever try and do these things. So 1933, Hitler gets appointed as the Chancellor of Germany by the President Paul von Hindenburg. And then pretty shortly after, right, the Reichstag burns down in a fire that is largely attributed to a Dutch communist, but that historians are pretty certain on was just a false flag operation that the Nazis did so that they could, more accurately and more effectively attack the communists who were their main political rivals at the time.
Okay, if I want to stop you there, if
Yeah.
I may. You mentioned that he had been made chancellor
Yeah.
by Hindenburg. Wouldn't you agree? Hindenburg said, because he got a lot of criticism for doing it, and Hindenburg said, I had no choice. It's best to compromise with him. Wouldn't you say that his making Hitler the chancellor at that point was one of the pivotal moments when they could have stopped him and should have?
Oh, absolutely. Hitler was undeniably a very persuasive speaker, because he was loud and he sounded very, very confident in the way that a lot of people that the far right considers persuasive speakers today. They're loud, they sound very confident, they're more than willing to speak over people, and they will never ever show any single shred of doubt, and that was Hitler to a T.
If I'm, yeah, I did you see the movie The Apprentice about Donald Trump's relationship to Roy Cohn?
I have not seen that movie, no.
It's a very excellent movie. And Roy Cohen told him, and it's all about this, his own it's a brilliant movie, I thought. And Cohen told him, there is no truth with a capital T. There's just the truth is you state it, you state it. It doesn't matter if it's in denial of reality. It doesn't matter if it's in denial of the facts. Just keep stating it, keep stating it, keep stating it. And that's really what you're referring to here, aren't you? The idea that if you just say something, that's a technique of authoritarians and totalitarians and fascists. You just keep saying it. And if it's wrong, you say it again. And if people say, well, that's not true, you say it again. And that's the sort of black magic of it, actually.
Yeah, that's sort of the pivotal technique and the primary technique of propaganda, which Hitler talks about extensively in chapter 6 of volume 2 of Mein Kampf. The chapter is just called War Propaganda, and it's the entire ethos around propaganda, and specifically war propaganda, is that you take a very simple idea and you repeat it to people over and over and over again until they believe it. And this is just a thing that works in everyday life. If you tell a, student in school that they're unintelligent, that they're low achieving, that they're never going to succeed, eventually they will come to believe that thing. And if you tell a group of people who are angry and upset and anxious over the, state of the economy and whether or not their children are going to be able to eat, that all of their problems are the fault of these foreigners coming in and stealing all of their jobs, eventually they're going to believe it because their problems don't get better. And they keep seeing these, these foreigners, these, whatever, this marginalized community just
Hitler, it was
in
the
their
Jews, yeah.
spaces. Yeah, for Hitler, it was the Jews, and it was the Roma and Sinti, and it was the disabled community, and it was, to a certain extent, Jehovah's Witnesses. And as long as those people keep existing in your public life, and someone keeps telling you they're the problem, it doesn't matter that they're also struggling the same as you are. They're different than you. And
Let me
so,
ask you a question. You might not be able to answer this, but you might have an opinion about it. When someone begins just stating a lie, and they know that I will be more likely to get what I want if I say it's a lie, even though I know it's a lie, but this is my propagandistic technique, do you think there comes a time when even they believe it?
yeah, yeah. So, right, that's one of the things that we just don't know about Hitler, and it's one of the things that we'll never really be able to know how much of what he said, how much of his rhetoric, how much of his policies were things that he earnestly, fervently believed in, and how much of it was just this was a convenient marginalized group, right? Anti-Semitism in Europe has been around had been around for almost 1,000 years,
No,
right
longer
at
than a
that point,
thousand
and
years.
longer than that, yeah. But so how much of it was just the Jews specifically, Hitler hated them more than, he valued the air in his lungs, and how much of it was just, this was just a convenient group that he could definitely convince people to hate. And we'll never really know which of those two is true, but it's definitely, I mean, we can lie to ourselves. That's definitely a thing that we can do. And if you lie to yourself often enough, right, and you tell yourself that that's the truth, you can certainly come to believe things that aren't true because you've just told yourself them often enough.
Well, I think what was interesting in that movie was that Cohen said, but there is no truth other than what you say.
Oh,
He also said this is not a nation of laws, it's a nation of men, which I thought was interesting. Because you see this happening in America today. Those of us who are so okay, it's the Constitution, it's a rule-based order, or it's a nation of laws. And you have this movement. It's not just Trump. It's a movement that says, shred it, doesn't matter. Kristi Noem didn't even know what habeas corpus was, obviously, when she was asked in the congressional hearing. And if it's in there, shred it, doesn't matter. Pam Bondi, doesn't matter. So if I may, take us a little over the bridge from, and obviously you're a historian, I trust that you will not do so inappropriately. Where are there comparisons that concern you, and what are those comparisons between things that were happening in fascism in Europe in the 30s and the 40s, and what is happening in America today.
Yeah, absolutely. So after Hitler came into power in 1933, he was appointed chancellor. There was the Reichstag fire, and then almost immediately after, right, in March of
So he
19...
used that. You said that was a false flag. He used it
Yes.
as an excuse to come full bore onto his enemies, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
That is the general historical consensus amongst historians who study that era of time. Which, when we say historical consensus, what we mean is the people who study this thing and the evidence that we've been able to find generally supports these conclusions. But a historical consensus is not the same as saying this is 100% absolutely the truth, and there's no way that you can argue against it. It's just we generally agree that the Reichstag fire was a false flag operation. It was not actually done by Marius van der Lubbe, a Dutch communist. It was just used as an excuse to take political action against the Communist Party in Germany.
Hold on, may I ask you a question?
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to ask you a leading question. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth. Do you see a comparison between that and what's happening post the assassination of Charlie Kirk?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And that's actually something that I was going to talk about in just a little bit, because right after the Reichstag fire, the Nazis built and started the Dachau concentration camp. That was the first concentration camp that the Nazis started, and it opened in May of 1933, and it was started mostly to house political prisoners, mostly socialists and communists. People considered enemies of the state, and a lot of them were arrested post Reichstag fire because the Nazis decided that now was a good time to take action against their political enemies. And a lot of the things that Trump has been saying recently, right? The Department of Homeland Security has deleted a report off of their website indicating that, right, the overwhelming majority of extremist political violence in the
Right
US in the
wing.
past 20 some odd years has been overwhelmingly committed by people who are politically right wing. And Trump is calling everyone who even remotely disagrees with him the radical left, right, which includes the Democratic Party, which based on just an objective view of the Overton window is not a left wing party. But you know, anyone who disagrees with Trump, who doesn't fall in lockstep with what he wants, is, a left wing enemy. And if we can blame the left for all of the political violence occurring, we can justify taking more extreme measures against them.
Well, Stephen Miller said that the Democratic Party was an extremist domestic terrorist organization.
Yeah, which is an insane thing to say, considering that that the Democratic Party has done nothing to stop Trump in anything that he's done in his second term.
So let's go back a little bit, because you were explaining
Yep.
the comparisons now and what is happening now. When you were just talking about Dachau being the first concentration camp.
Yeah, so the Nazis
How do you
built that.
see Alligator, Alcatraz, and all of the detainment camps that are being built today? Would you describe these as concentration camps?
I would go a step further to describe them, especially Alligator Alcatraz, considering that about 1,200 people who were in that camp have disappeared and we don't know what happened to them. I would go so far as to describe them as death camps.
Yeah,
Because a concentration camp is just a fancy way of saying open air prison, right? It's a place where we concentrate people of a particular ethnicity, political, affiliation, etc. But death camps are where we take people of a political, nationality, political affiliation, with the intent of killing them. And when 1,200 people just disappear with no record of them, that raises some huge red flags.
huge red flags, including the fact that military planes, some of them were military planes. There are those who say that the radar shows the planes going into the middle of the ocean, then coming back. I mean, you don't know what to believe right now, but there's enough to be concerned. I want to tell you a line I once read about Hitler, and it just stopped me in my tracks. Hitler is said to have said towards the end of the war, the only way they could have stopped us is if they had come at us early, swift, and hard. And that goes back to what you were saying about how the resistance has been so many Hindenburg, so many people. Sometimes I see Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer and others talking as though we're talking about negotiating with people in good faith. This is insane. Someone was telling me the other day that he attended the arraignment of James Comey, and he said that the strangest thing about witnessing the arraignment was the almost imprint of normalcy that the media was able to give to this. Are you under the impression that we're treating a situation that is like code red? This is a house on fire, and people are treating it with this strange, bizarre normalcy, almost out of fear of facing what's really happening?
Yeah, we're the best way that I can describe it is that we're in the middle of a three-ring circus that is actively on fire, and also there's a serial killer in the middle of it, and everyone's just treating it like it's a regular Tuesday.
That's right. That's exactly. You put it
It's
better than I did.
yeah,
I also read that there was, early on in Hitler's reign, there was an international conference. You probably know about this. It was an international conference of some sort where all these world leaders came together to discuss the Hitler issue and the Hitler question and the Hitler problem. And every single nation said, we think we can work with him. And there was only one that said, nope, we got to deal with this, and we got to deal with it now, and that was Costa Rica.
Yeah, no, appeasement was a big part of, what made World War II as bad as it was, right? One of Hitler's big pushes and one of the things that gained him power was pushing back against the demilitarization, aspects of the Treaty of Versailles, and saying that, like, Germany has the right to not only, breathing space and living room, like Lebensraum as they called it, but also they have the right to have a military, Hitler told people. And so, when he took the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, all of the nations in Europe who were so tired, right, from World War I decided, you know what, we don't want another war. We don't want to do this again. So you can have this. You can have this part of Czechoslovakia. We don't really care about the Czechs. It's fine. But don't do anything else. Right? And they told Hitler that just like again and again and again and again and again as he continued to take a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more until he could do whatever he wanted, because no one had stopped him until Germany had built up a truly massive and overwhelming military force.
And then every time they invaded another country, he would absorb their industrial capacity so that he could exponentially grow it. Now, as long as you're talking about appeasement, as long as you're talking about, when you just said, we're tired, we don't want to have to do this again, that made me think, of course, of what's happening today in Europe, Putin, and the Ukraine. I was just seeing yesterday Ursula von der Leyen, is that how you pronounce her name, the head of the EU, talking about
so.
all the drones, right, that are appearing, and that we must take this seriously. Would you, first of all, is there anything more that you'd like to say about what's happening in America today? And then I want to hear your opinions about what's going on with Putin in Ukraine.
I mean, there are a lot of things that I could say about what's happening in the United States right now, but then we'd be here for another 2 hours, so we can, it's a good time to move on to a different topic, so we're not just stuck in the weeds.
Okay. And we'd love to have you back sometime, because I know people would love to ask you some questions. When you were talking about, of course, you have a degree in genocide studies, and genocide is obviously a tragically hot topic today. Now, you have said that you consider what is going on in Ukraine to be a genocide, as well as what has been going on in Gaza. Can you explain why that is?
Yeah, absolutely. So the UN has a very specific definition of genocide. They established this in 1945. It was fully ratified by 1951. One of the aspects of genocide, right, from the UN's Convention for the Punishment and Prevention of the Crime of Genocide, it's Article 2, subsection E, states that forcibly transferring children of a group to another group is genocide. Historical examples of this would include like the residential schools that existed in the US, Canada, and Australia,
Native
where indigenous
Americans.
communities were, put into these schools and then forcibly indoctrinated into a colonizing culture, and out of, right, they were forbidden from speaking their native languages. Needles were put through their tongues if they did. This is like a verifiable historical fact, and various other horrors and atrocities. Now, I can't speak to needles in tongues in the case of Russia and Ukraine, but we do know that according to the Ukrainian government, they have been able to verify the identities of about 19,000 Ukrainian children who have been taken by the Russian government and, put in either a residential school-esque system or adopted out into Russian families with no recourse of reuniting with their original family. The Russian government, though, has stated on record that they have rescued, quote unquote, over 700,000 Ukrainian children from a war zone. But we don't know where all of those kids are.
Yeah,
But any
yeah.
forcible transfer of children from their, ancestral culture into another one, and any attempt at indoctrinating them from their ancestral culture into another one, that is genocide, right? Because when Raphael Lemkin coined the term genocide, he chose the things that he did, right? A national, ethnic, racial, or religious group because of their culture carrying capacity. So any attempt to destroy the culture, right, a particular culture, is itself a genocidal act.
So I have three questions to ask you.
Yeah.
In your opinion, what makes the American left so loath to hold Putin, even in their minds, accountable for this rampant injustice?
This is something that I have fought with a number of people about a number of times. There is an unfortunate sentiment amongst the American left and amongst just the Western left in general that anything that is anti-US is at least better than the US. So there's a little bit of a pass given to things that are happening in other places, to atrocities that places like Russia or China are committing because they are combating US imperialism and US colonialism, and that's at least a better alternative than everything that's going on historically in the United States.
Wow. Okay. Now I want to ask you three questions. What was Hitler's ultimate goal? What is Putin's ultimate goal? And what is Trump and his crowd? What is their ultimate goal?
Yeah. So Hitler's ultimate goal is pretty easy to define because it was stated pretty early on. The idea was, right, the Third Reich was meant to be the 1,000-year Reich. It was meant to be a return to the German glory days. It was meant to, just be, like how like the sun never sets on the British Empire. It was going to be that kind of vibe, but for Germany, right? They were going to take all of the lands that they considered ancestrally, ethnically German, and they were going to hold on to them and create a, pure, perfect Aryan state, which was based on some weird pseudo-Norse, pseudo-mysticist, idea of white supremacy.
Right.
Putin's ultimate goal is, and he's stated this on record, is to just bring back the full extent of the Soviet Union at its height. He's gone on
So
record as
that's
saying
why
that is,
Ursula,
yeah,
I'm sorry, so that's why what Ursula is talking about now, Estonia, all the Baltic states, why
yeah.
everybody's beginning to freak out, correct?
Yeah, because, it's not going to, right, if Putin succeeds in Ukraine, and I don't think that he's going to, and I hope that he won't, hope more than think, but he's not going to stop there. He wants to, right, bring back everything that had formerly been part of the Soviet Union, which includes anything that had been a Warsaw Pact state. And Trump's ultimate goal is just the goal of Project 2025 and the Heritage Foundation, which is ultimately to create a Christian nationalist white ethno-state in the United States. They're going after, right, they're starting with going after political dissidents. They're starting with going after the people who are, visibly and easily identifiable as a target group, right? The trans community and the immigrant community, but it's not going to stop there. They're going to continue going until they create the homogenous, religious, ethnic group that they want it to be ultimately, unless, people continue to push back against those things. And that is the good thing, right, about fascism in the end, is that ultimately it always fails because it's always, so insular and so singular that it unifies anyone who isn't part of that very specific group of people that they like.
Wow. Okay, so would you say that this Christian nationalist, white supremacist, Project 2025 ultimate project for our country is basically a fascist movement?
Sorry, I knocked my headphone out, but I think I got the gist of what you were saying. Yes, I would say that, the current Trump administration, the Heritage Foundation, Project 2025 is ultimately a fascist movement, right? They hit, and I've talked about this, both in Trump's first administration and in his second administration, right? How closely things that he's done and is doing match up with classic characteristics of fascism from lists made up by like Umberto Eco, who had grown up in fascist Italy and wrote an essay called Fascism in 1995, as well as Lawrence Britt, who wrote an essay called Fascism Anyone in the 2000s after studying regimes like Pinochet, Suharto, Francisco, Mussolini, and Hitler.
Do you feel there's still time?
Yeah. So here is always the thing about, right, resistance to fascism. Fascism is not an end state, right? It's not a thing that happens and then it's done and then there's nothing that we can do about it. Even if you are in a fully fascist state, there's always still something that you can do to fight back against it. It's going to, there's going to be bad times and there's going to be marginalized communities who unfortunately suffer greatly, right? Because that's the goal of fascism. But, there's no point at which you can no longer resist.
I want to ask you a question, but you do not feel we are there yet?
We're getting closer and closer, and a lot of that is mostly just because of the way that the American political system is set up. We've put so much power and authority in the hands of representatives and in the hands of the military and the policing force that the average person, just, like you and me and just a person on the street, feels like there's not much that they can do. But because fascism is so inherently tied to the economy and to the dominant power structures, there are always things that we're not at a point of no return. We're at a very bad point, but we're not, and we will never be at a point of absolutely no return.
Tell me if I'm correct about this. It seems to me, both with the Third Reich and with the inhumane conditions at places like Alligator Alcatraz and with the ICE raids themselves and the way the agents are behaving, is it correct to say that there's an almost fetishism of cruelty among fascists?
Yeah. Yeah, that would definitely be. So fascism and, genocidal regimes and any kind of authoritarian, state, one of the things that they rely on, right, to facilitate this cruelty is just what we call dehumanization, right? Which the dictionary defines as to remove from a person or group of people the positive aspects of human life, but in more general and non-jargony terms just means it's when we refer to a group of people as anything other than human. Jews were referred to in the Holocaust as vermin or a disease. The Tutsi in the Rwanda genocide were referred to as the Kinya-Rwanda word inyenzi, which means cockroach,
Cockroach,
right?
yeah.
So, cruelty is just sort of an unfortunately pretty commonly human thing towards non-human creatures. The number of children who have taken a magnifying glass to anthills is disturbingly high. But if you can convince the people in positions of power that you've told, hey, you're allowed to do these things to these people because they're not real people,
Yeah,
it's so easy, right? Like a video game, to put a
yeah,
layer of separation between the people
yeah,
committing the cruelty and the people they're committing it against, that it's almost
yeah.
like you're not doing it right in reality.
Even sometimes when it's people that you've grown up with and are your friends.
Yeah.
We got reports from what happened in Rwanda, what happened before Tiananmen Square, and so forth. John, I'm so grateful to. I'm sorry, were you going to say something?
I was going to say one more thing, which is this like the fetishization of cruelty is an interesting way of putting it, and it's definitely an aspect of it. But like when you look at like so, there's a battalion of in the Third Reich called the Reserve Police Battalion 101. The Nazis had a lot of reserve police battalions who were active moreover in the eastern front of the Holocaust, closer towards the Soviet Union, and every single member of those reserve police battalions engaged in cruelties and massacres and mass killings of target groups for the Nazis. But they also all, pretty much all of them, had rampant levels of drug abuse, alcoholism, and
Right,
suicide
right,
in
right,
order to
right,
either cope with
right.
the things that they did or because they couldn't cope with those things. So
Well,
like
they definitely did that. I'm sorry. They definitely
no,
did
go
that
ahead.
before Tiananmen Square. They got the soldiers completely stoned
Yeah,
before
and
they
it's
sent
also
them out there.
something that we're seeing
Yeah.
in IDF soldiers, right, over everything that's happening in Gaza. We're seeing, increasing reports of what they call PTSD for the things that they've done, right, for the horrors that they've committed. And this is a common thing amongst fascist soldiers, is that they've been conditioned to believe that the things that they're doing are necessary and the people that they're committing them against are not real people. But there's only so many times you can hear a child scream before it gets to you.
Yeah, you break, right.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because I think all these videos that we're seeing online of the ICE agents and the way they're behaving and throwing people to the ground, screaming mothers, screaming children, I think the American people are decent people. We're
Yeah.
good people. I feel very strongly about what's happening right now, that the ultimate result will not be based on what they do. It will be based on who we are and what we do. And I think the American people do have a conscience. And I think that's one of the reasons why, whether it has to do with even starting things like making it unlawful to sit on the sidewalk. Why? Because you don't want people to see homeless people. Or really the whole economic and political system in the United States for decades now has worked on the premise that do what you have to do to provide a certain way of life, and whatever suffering has to occur, make sure it's on the other side of town or on the other side of the world. But this is right in front of us. It's online. People are seeing it. And I think people on the left and on the right are beginning to, there's a rising sense of, no, 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 this must not happen on our watch. And that's my hope. It sounds like it's your hope as well.
The internet is both a blessing and a
And a curse.
curse in the
Absolutely.
cases of
No
these,
doubt about it.
because it on the one hand it does allow for us to see in real time, right, everything that's happening in the United States, in Ukraine, in Gaza. It's being basically live streamed. We can see it more or less as it's happening, and there's no way to falsify or doctor those records that are occurring. because they're being so independently verified by so many other sources, all posting the same details. But it also allows, right, if you're not in the spaces where you're seeing those things, the rapid information age allows us to, right, like so many of these recent attacks on, ICE agents, or all of these things have been happening, right? Like the FBI and Kush Patel put out an Instagram post about, bullets that they'd found at a scene that apparently said anti-ICE on them within like minutes of them being found. This was evidence in a crime, and they're just posting it like it's verified and a real thing. And like they're just releasing details of a what should be, a more or less classified crime that they're investing. Like, why are you releasing details to the public of an
Because
ongoing
just theater to
investigation?
them. To them, it's all just theater. And
Right, yes.
I don't know about that specific instance, but there are enough where it's so obvious. They don't just gaslight. These people lie.
Yeah.
So, John, thank you. This
Thank
was
you.
very illuminating. So appreciate it. And I know so many people will feel very illumined in their understanding because you were here with us. Thank you very, very much. Any information you want to give people about how they can find you, what they should read, and so forth?
Yeah, if you want to find me, you can find me pretty much mostly exclusively on Instagram these days, the_history_wizard.
Well, thank you. And you are quite a source of information and education. All my best to you. Thank you so, so much. And everybody, I know that this is going to be an interview that you probably want to watch again at some point, spread around. Did I hear that right? What did he say about this exactly? I'm very grateful to John for being here. I'm very grateful to you for listening. Remember, this is posted on the Substack. If you want to hear more, let me know. And remember also what John said, and I agree wholeheartedly. It's never too late. We just need to take care of this shit. Thank you so much. All my best. Bye-bye.